In the unforgiving gray steel world of submarine warfare, the periscope is not just a tool. It is the captain's eye. It is his connection to the world of the living, his only window from the crushing, silent darkness into the sunlit world of the hunt. It is the difference between being a predator and being prey. To lose that eye is to be blinded, to be castrated, to be rendered helpless. A submarine without its periscope is just a 700-ton steel coffin, groping in the dark, waiting for the sonar ping that will announce its death. The doctrine is clear. A boat that is blinded must return to base. To continue a patrol is not just reckless, it is suicidal. But what happens when the boat is commanded by a man who doesn't care about doctrine? What happens when the captain is a man who sees suicide and glory as two sides of the same coin? This is the story of Kapitänleutnant Rolf der Verrückte Steiner, a man whose own command thought him dangerously unstable. And this is the story of how, in a moment of sheer, calculated madness, he took his crippled, blinded submarine and pointed it at the heart of an entire Allied fleet, armed with nothing but a broken piece of glass and a pathological refusal to die. Welcome back to Battlefield Legends. We are dedicated to uncovering the most incredible, unbelievable, and often forgotten stories of war, the tales of men who pushed the limits of human endurance and sanity. If you believe that history is more dramatic than any fiction, you are in the right place. Before we dive into this abyss, help our channel on its mission. Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. It is the single best way to ensure you never miss an episode. And if you find value in this story, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm to share this history with more people. Finally, we want to know where our community is. Drop a comment below and let us know. What country and city are you watching from? Now, seal the hatch and brace for impact. The world ended in a sound. It was not a boom. It was a universal bone-dissolving crack. It was the sound of the Atlantic Ocean, all 9 million square miles of it, hitting the hull of U-505 with a single colossal fist. Inside the submarine, it was a universe of pure, unadulterated terror. The U-boat, a Type YC, a long-range Wolf, was pitched 30 degrees onto its bow. Men, plates, cans of food, and wrenches became a single, screaming projectile, launched into the forward torpedo room. The red emergency lights flickered, casting the control room in a scene from hell. A chief petty officer was slammed against the valve manifold, the high-pressure hiss of compressed air mixing with the sound of his ribs snapping. Water was everywhere. Not a leak, but a spray. A pipe in the overhead had burst, and icy salt water was atomizing into the air, drenching the crew, mixing with their sweat and their blood. The boat was dying, and outside the hunters were celebrating. Ping, ping, ping. The sound of the British ASDIC was no longer a question. It was a taunt. They were directly overhead. The destroyer, HMS Banshee, was making its turn, its crew already rolling the next ashcan off the rack. In the center of this chaos stood Kapitänleutnant Rolf Steiner. He was a large man, a bull with a tangle of black hair and eyes that burned with a feverish, unsettling intensity. His men called him Der Verrückte, the madman. Not always, and never to his face, but they all thought it. He was a captain who didn't dodge destroyer screens. He charged them. He was a man who saw caution as a form of cowardice. Now that madness had finally brought them here, 200 meters below the surface, in a steel can that was actively trying to implode. "Hold her!" Steiner roared, his voice cutting through the panic. "Blow all ballast! Get me depth! Get me control, you pigs!" His first officer, a thin, precise, and terrified man named Lieutenant Ernst Vogel, was clinging to the navigation table. "Kapitän!" Vogel shouted, his voice cracking. "The hydroplanes are sluggish. We are still sinking. The pressure. The hull is—" Boom crump. The next depth charge was a giant's foot stomping on them. This one was closer. The light bulbs in the control room didn't just break, they vaporized. The men were plunged into total, screaming darkness, lit only by the faint greenish glow of the radium dials. "Emergency lighting!" Steiner bellowed. A moment later, a few dim, battery-powered bulbs flickered on, illuminating the panic. "Report!" Steiner demanded, his grip white on the periscope housing. Vogel got the damage reports from the voice pipes. They were catastrophic. Aft torpedo room is flooding, sir. The pump is struggling. Engine room reports the port diesel is. It's been torn from its mounts. Hydrophones are dead. The array is gone. And then the final, fatal report from the senior machinist. Capitan, the periscopes, both of them, the Banshee's last charge. It was a direct hit on the conning tower. The observation scope. It is gone, ripped clean off. The attack scope. The housing is shattered. The optics are flooded. Sir, we are blind. A silence fell over the control room. It was a silence heavier and more terrifying than the depth charges. The flooding, the engine, the pumps. They could be fixed. But a boat without its eyes was a ghost, a dead man. They had survived the attack, but they had lost the war. They were a 700-ton hunk of scrap metal, and all they could do was pray. Steiner was breathing, hard, in, out, in, out. He was a caged animal. Vogel, the voice of terrified reason, said, "Sir, we must abort. If we can surface tonight. If we can just get away. We must make for Lorient. The war is over for us." Steiner said nothing. He walked to the hydrophone station. The sonar man was dead, his head having met the steel bulkhead. Steiner pushed the body aside, grabbed the spare set of headphones, and plugged them in. He was met with static, a roaring, useless sound. The external array was indeed gone. But then, through the static, he heard the faint, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the Banshee's screws. They were moving off. They thought the job was done. They had heard the U-boat's hull screaming. They had seen the oil slick from a ruptured external fuel tank, and they were marking their charts. U-505, sunk. The hunters were gone. They were alive. But they were crippled. Vogel was already giving orders. "Get a damage control party to the aft compartment. We need to stop that leak. Get the bilge pumps." Steiner held up a hand. The gesture was so quiet, so sudden that every man in the control room froze. "Shut up," Steiner whispered. He was listening, not with the headphones, but with his feet, with his hands on the hull, with the U-boat itself. He was listening to the ocean. "They are gone," he said finally. He turned to Vogel. "Damage report. The attack scope. You said it was flooded?" "Yes, Herr Capitan," Vogel said, relieved the captain was finally focusing on escape. "Shattered. The lens assembly is... it's a ruin," the machinist said. "The housing," Steiner interrupted, his voice a low growl. "Is the housing intact? Can we raise it?" Vogel blanched. "Raise it? Sir, what for? It's broken." "Can we raise the tube?" Steiner roared, his madness flaring. "The hydraulics, are they—" A technician, his face covered in oil, ran in. "The hydraulics they're leaking, sir. But the motor might—" "Yes, Capitan. I think we can raise it, but it will not." "See." Steiner grinned. It was a terrible, terrifying sight. It was the grin of a skull. "Good," he said. He looked at Vogel. "Mr. Vogel, you are right. The hydrophones are gone. The observation scope is gone. The attack scope is shattered." He paused, letting the crew absorb their own doom. "But the radio," he said, tapping a gauge, "is still working." He pointed to the radio operator. "Get me the last broadcast from High Command, the one from 0400. The operator, shaking, fumbled with his logs. "Sir, that was the convoy report, BD-44, but it's 500 kilometers away, and we—" "Just read it," Steiner snapped. The operator read, "Convoy BD-44, 41 ships, escorted by Task Force Ocelot, 3 cruisers, 8 destroyers, routing. Due to weather they are diverting. They are seeking emergency anchorage in Vestfjorden, near Narvik." A map of Norway was pulled down. Vestfjorden, a deep, massive inland sea, a safe harbor, a place where a fleet would feel protected, where it would anchor. Steiner was breathing heavily again, that same rhythmic animal sound. A fleet, he whispered. Vogel looked at him in disbelief. Capitan, no, you cannot. We are blind. We are leaking. We are ordered to return to base. This is suicide. This is madness. It was the first time the word had been spoken aloud in front of him. Steiner turned very slowly to face his first officer. The control room was so quiet, the only sound was the drip, drip, drip of the ruptured pipe. Steiner stepped close to Vogel, his face inches from the terrified lieutenant. You are correct, Mr. Vogel, Steiner said, his voice a predator's purr. It is madness, but they have taken my eyes, they have crippled my boat, they have wounded my pride, and now, an entire Allied fleet is hiding in a fjord, waiting to be refueled. He tapped the cracked, useless periscope housing. They think I am a dead man. He turned to the helm. Helmsman, change of course. Bearing 010, all ahead. 1/3. We will be quiet. We will be slow. The helmsman didn't move. He was paralyzed by the sheer insanity of the order. I said, Helmsman, bearing 010. The man, startled, grabbed the wheel. Jawohl, Herr Kapitän. Vogel was ashen-faced. Sir, please, reconsider. The crew. The boat. We will never make it. Steiner looked around the control room, his burning eyes landing on every man. He saw their fear. He saw their doubt. He saw their terror, and he fed on it. We will make it, Steiner proclaimed, his voice now a sermon. Because they are not looking for us. We are already dead. We are a ghost ship, and a ghost has one advantage. No one believes in it, until it is at their throat. He slapped the navigation table. Mr. Vogel, I want a solution. Not for escape. I want a solution for Vestfjorden. I want to know where they will anchor. I want to know the depth. I want to know the tide. He was a man possessed, a demon of the deep. The crew of U-505, crippled and blind, was not returning home. The mad captain was taking them on one last, impossible, insane hunt. He was going to find an entire fleet, and he was going to do it. With a periscope that could not see. The journey north was a descent into a special kind of hell. It was not the quick, fiery hell of an attack, but a slow, cold, and suffocating one. U-505 was no longer a predator. It was a wounded beast, dragging itself across the ocean floor, leaking, groaning, and utterly blind. For 7 days, they crawled. They could only travel at night, surfacing to recharge their batteries and replenish their air. Every man on the conning tower a nervous wreck, scanning the black horizon not for targets, but for the gray silhouette of a destroyer that would mean their final, merciful end. During the day, they would submerge to a safe depth of 100 meters, and the real torture would begin. The boat was a symphony of misery. The aft leak, which damage control had slowed but not stopped, was a constant weeping reminder of their vulnerability. A steady drip, drip, drip of seawater, mixed with a film of diesel fuel from the ruptured internal line, created a putrid, unbreathable fog. The air was foul, thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, diesel, and the sharp, coppery smell of fear. But the sound was worse. Without the hydrophones, they were deaf. The only sounds were their own. The whine of the electric motors, the groans of the hull protesting the pressure, the steady clank of the bilge pumps. Every sound was a betrayal, a potential death knell broadcast into the silent water. And in the center of it all, Kapitän Lieutenant Rolf Steiner reigned. He was not just a captain. He was a prophet of his own dark religion. He rarely slept. He haunted the control room, a hulking, greasy shadow, his eyes burning with an intensity that terrified the crew more than the sea itself. He had one singular obsession. Every hour, on the hour, he would give the same insane command. Raise the attack scope. Lieutenant Vogel, his first officer, would have to relay the order. Vogel was a man being hollowed out by terror. He was keeping a secret log, a meticulous record of every command, every course change, every unhinged decision. He was convinced they were all going to die, and he wanted the record to show why. "Sir," Vogel would protest, his voice thin, I must remind you. The scope is flooded. It is broken. Raising it. It is a waste of the hydraulic motors. It serves no purpose." Steiner would just turn, his gaze so heavy, so full of contempt, that Vogel would wither. "Mr. Vogel," Steiner would purr, "you are a man of paper. You see what is written. I am a man of the sea. I see what is there. Now, raise the tube." The order would be given. The weary, terrified technician would engage the hydraulic motor, and with a sick, groaning whine, the 20-foot steel tube of the attack periscope would rise from its well, passing through the control room and up into the conning tower. And then the sound would begin. Because the outer lens assembly was shattered, the moment the periscope head broke the surface of the conning tower's flooded outer fairing, seawater would begin to pour down the internal tube. It was not a view. It was a fountain. A torrent of icy Atlantic water would gush from the shattered eyepiece, spraying across the control room, drenching the helmsman, the navigation table, and Steiner himself. The crew, hardened veterans, would flinch, their nerves shattering, as their own boat seemed to be vomiting the ocean into their faces. "Hold it!" Steiner would roar over the sound of the cascade. He would stand directly in front of the broken eyepiece, his hands gripping the handles, his face pointed up at the useless gushing metal. He would close his eyes. The freezing, salty water would mat his black hair, run down his face like tears, soak his uniform. He would stand there for a full minute, stock still, as if in a trance. The crew stared, their eyes wide with horror. This was not command. This was a pagan ritual. This was madness. "What is he doing?" the young helmsman whispered to the navigator, his voice trembling. "Is he drinking it?" The navigator, an older fatalistic man, just shook his head. "He is. Tasting the sea." Vogel watched, his knuckles white, as his captain communed with his broken god. After a minute that stretched into an eternity, Steiner would take a deep, shuddering breath. "Downscope," he'd whisper. The whining hydraulics would lower the tube, the cascade would slow to a trickle, and a new puddle of seawater would sloshing on the deck. Steiner would turn, his face dripping, a strange, ecstatic calm on his features. "Course 012, he'd say. "We are in the current. The Gulf Stream is weaker. We are too far east." He was navigating. He was navigating a 700-ton submarine, blind, by the taste and temperature of the water pouring from his own broken instrument. He was feeling the subtle shifts in the North Atlantic drift, sensing the salinity, the coldness that told him they were nearing the Arctic. Vogel would check the dead reckoning charts, his hands shaking. And the terrifying part? The part that made Vogel truly question his own sanity? Steiner was right. His mad corrections were more accurate than their own blind guesses. He was feeling his way north. For 7 days, this ritual was their life. Raise the scope, the cascade, the trance, the course correction, the despair. The men were hollowed-out shells. They were not sailors. They were the damned, chauffeured to hell by a madman who could taste the ocean. Then, on the 8th night, it changed. They surfaced into a biting Arctic wind. The sea was calmer, the air sharp with the smell of ice. The radio operator, who had been working for days to jury-rig a long-wire antenna, suddenly stiffened. "Sir, I have signals, heavy signals, encrypted, British naval frequencies. It is close. Very close." Steiner was at his side in an instant. He grabbed a spare set of headphones. The airwaves were alive. It was the chatter of a fleet. Not a convoy, but a fleet. Radio checks, signal tests, coded logistics orders. The sound of a massive anchored naval force. "They are here," Steiner whispered. He looked at Vogel, his eyes alight with a terrifying, triumphant fire. "They are in the fjord, just as the paper said, Mr. Vogel." They submerged, the hatch clanging shut like a coffin lid. They were at the mouth of Vestfjorden, a massive 10-mile wide, 80-mile long inland sea, and it was a death trap. Unlike the open ocean, a fjord is a maze of underwater mountains, of sheer granite cliffs that plunge thousands of feet, of unpredictable violent currents, and of rocks. Sunken, uncharted, boat-killing rocks. To navigate it with full charts and working sonar was a nightmare. To do it blind was not suicide. It was a fantasy. Vogel, for the first time, refused. "No, sir." His voice was shaking, but he stood his ground. I will not. I will not be party to this. You will kill us all. You will drive us onto the rocks in the first 10 minutes. We are blind. We are deaf." "I will not give the order, Capitan." The crew froze. This was it. Mutiny, the ultimate sin. Steiner looked at Vogel. He did not yell. He did not rage. He just smiled. That terrible, slow, skull grin. "Mutiny, Mr. Vogel? A man of paper. You have found your spine. Good. But you are still a man of paper." He turned to the technician. "Raise the attack scope." Vogel's heart sank. "Sir, we are at 100 meters. The periscope. It will not reach the surface. It's... What's the point?" "Raise it!" Steiner roared. The motor whined. The tube went up. It stopped. It was just a steel pole extending up into the black, crushing darkness. It was not gushing water. It was just there. Useless. "Now," Steiner said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Take us in, slow, bearing. 350, straight into the mouth." "But sir, do it!" The helmsman, sobbing, pushed the boat forward, into the black rocky maw of the fjord. "Now," Steiner said, and he walked over to the periscope tube. He put his hands on it gently. He closed his eyes. "Mr. Vogel," he said, "I do not need to see the rocks. I only need to hear them." He was turning his entire 700-ton submarine into a dowsing rod. He was using the 20-foot steel tube of the periscope, the one part of his boat that was connected to the conning tower outside the pressure hull, as a giant antenna, an antenna for sound. "Everyone, be silent." He was listening. He was feeling vibrations, the vibrations of the water, the deep, resonate echoes of the fjord itself, traveling down the steel tube. He was, in his madness, inventing a new kind of sonar. A passive, tactile sonar, using his own broken periscope. "Port 10 degrees, he whispered, his hands on the tube. "There is a shadow, a coldness, to starboard, a mountain, under the water." Vogel looked at the chart. There it was, a massive uncharted pinnacle, a rock that would have ripped their belly open, and Steiner had felt it. The crew of U-505 stared. Their captain, their madman, was now officially a wizard, a dark wizard, taking them blind into the heart of a fleet, navigating a granite maze by touching the echoes of the water. The hunt had begun. For 12 hours, U-505 was not a submarine. It was a nerve ending. It was a single 700-ton sensory organ, and its brain was Rolf Steiner. The control room became a sacred space, a tomb of absolute pressurized silence. The men, who had been veterans of 100 screaming patrols, now learned the true meaning of terror. Not the bang, but the creak. Not the attack, but the anticipation. They were inside the rocky, black, underwater maze of the Vestfjorden, and they were blind. Every man was frozen at his station, his muscles locked, his breath held. The only sound permitted was the thump, thump, thump of their own terrified hearts, a sound that seemed deafening in the unnatural quiet. The order for dead slow was an understatement. The electric motors were barely turning, a faint, ghostly hum that was more a vibration than a sound, pushing them through the black water at a single knot. And in the center of the room, Steiner stood, his hands placed flat, almost lovingly, on the cold, vertical steel of the attack periscope tube. He had not moved in hours. His eyes were closed, his head was bowed, and he was listening. He was listening to the skin of his ship. The 20-foot steel pole was his antenna, his divining rod, his conduit to the dark world outside. It was a tactile, haptic map being drawn directly onto his palms, the flow of the deep fjord currents, the way the water bent around unseen obstacles. It all transmitted up the steel as a series of infinitely complex, subtle vibrations. He was, in his madness, interpreting the acoustic shape of the water. "Port. 3 degrees," he would whisper, his voice a dry rasp. The helmsman, his face a mask of sweat, would obey instantly, his movements agonizingly slow. "Steady. Steady." Steiner would tilt his head, as if listening to a distant, complex symphony. "The water. It is. Faster. On the starboard side. The echo. It is hard. Granite. A wall. The chart. Vogel. The chart is a lie. The wall is 200 meters closer." Lieutenant Vogel, his mutiny forgotten, his rational world shattered, would check the chart. His pencil would tremble as he made a new mark. The Capitan was right. The chart, based on pre-war soundings, was a guess. Steiner was feeling the truth. The crew watched, not with awe, but with a deep religious dread. They were no longer on a military vessel. They were in the belly of a leviathan, and a mad prophet was speaking to it. For hours, this was their life. A whisper, a course correction, the creak of the hull as it responded. They were crawling, foot by foot, past underwater ridges, through canyons of unseen rock. Then it happened. The vibration in Steiner's hands changed. It was no longer the deep, resonant thrum of water against rock. It was a new sound, a faint tick-tick-tick, a high-pitched, unnatural vibration. "All stop!" Steiner's voice was a shot in the dark. The helmsman slammed the lever. The motors died. The U-boat, its momentum still carrying it, drifted in perfect, horrifying silence. "What is it?" Vogel whispered, his nerve breaking. "A patrol boat? Their hydrophones?" Steiner shook his head, his hand still pressed to the steel. His face was pale. "No, it's steel. It's in the water, ahead of us. It is singing." He was feeling the vibration of the fjord's current whistling through a massive man-made object, a net. "The boom," Vogel said, his voice choking. He pointed at the chart. "The British. A triple-layer anti-submarine net, across the Narrows. We are at it. We are at it." The crew's blood turned to ice. They had, in their blindness, navigated perfectly into the one thing designed to trap and kill them. They were at the mouth of a steel web, a web that was almost certainly laced with mines. "Take us down," Steiner said, his voice terrifyingly calm. 140 meters. Now." Vogel was frantic. "Sir, the chart. The bottom is. It's 130 meters. We will hit the bottom. And the net. The net goes to the bottom." "The chart is paper, Mr. Vogel," Steiner snapped. "I am touching the fjord. The echo below us is soft. It is mud, silt, the net. The net is taut. It is strung between the cliffs. It will be 5, maybe 10 meters. Off the mud. We will go. Under. We will scrape the belly of the fjord." It was an order of such sublime, profound insanity that it broke the last vestiges of the crew's will. They were going to intentionally run their boat aground, blind, at the base of a minefield, and pray there was a gap. 140, Vogel repeated, his voice dead. The dive planes were angled. The U-boat, heavy from its unrepaired leaks, began its descent into the final, crushing darkness. They didn't need gauges to know they were deep. The hull was screaming. The pressure was immense. Every rivet, every weld, was groaning in a high-pitched metallic shriek. The men covered their ears, not to block the sound, but as a primal, futile gesture of fear. Cree. Scrap. The sound was wrong. It was not the squelch of mud. It was the hard, definitive, sickening sound of metal on rock. They had hit. "Sir!" the helmsman shrieked. We've hit!" But Steiner held up his hand. "Silence!" he commanded. He was still at the periscope, his face a mask of inhuman concentration. Clink, 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 clink. It was a new sound, coming from above. It was the sound of the anti-submarine net, the links of the net. They were tapping against the conning tower. They were not 10 meters above. They were on them. The boat had hit a submerged ridge of rock, and that impact had pitched their bow up, directly into the bottom of the steel curtain. The control room was a frozen tableau of human terror. Every man was staring at the ceiling, as if they could see the mine that was, at this very second, just feet above their heads, its chemical horns scraping their hull. A single, unlucky touch. All, slow, astern. Steiner whispered, his voice barely a breath. Gently, back us, off. The rock. The motors engaged. The boat groaned. A sound so violent, so loud, it was as if a giant was dragging his fingernails across their hull. It was a cable from the net, dragging along the entire length of the boat, from the conning tower, past the deck, over the aft. And then, silence. It was gone. They were free. The boat, its stern motor still in reverse, had slid off the rock. "All stop," Steiner said. He was sweating now, in great, greasy drops. "Port 20. Dive planes were hard. Take us down. To the mud, now." This time, when they descended, the sound was soft, a long, wet schlurp. The belly of the U-505 settled into the deep, cold silt of the fjord bottom. They were under the rock, and under the net. All ahead, dead slow, Steiner commanded, "Crawl, crawl." For the next hour, U-505 moved not as a submarine, but as a worm. They burrowed, blind and deaf, through the stinking, primeval mud of the fjord bottom, with a curtain of steel and high explosives just feet above their heads. The scrape of the hull against the mud, the clank of rocks passing, was the only sound. The air in the boat was a toxic, unbreathable poison. The CO2 scrubbers were struggling. The men were panting, their vision tunneling, their lungs burning. They were suffocating. But their captain was a statue, his hands on his broken totem. After an hour that lasted a lifetime, he stiffened. "The mud is gone," he whispered. "The water, it is still." He took his hands off the periscope. The crew flinched. The Prophet was letting go. "Bring her up," Steiner said, his voice thick with exhaustion. 20 meters, periscope depth." Vogel, his face slack-jawed, gave the order. The boat, groaning in relief, rose from the depths. It stabilized at 20 meters. They were through. They were inside the anchorage, but they were still blind. "Raise the attack scope," Steiner said, his voice now a low growl. The crew, now his willing, terrified disciples, obeyed. The hydraulic motor whined. The 20-foot tube rose from its well, and, as before, it broke the surface. And the ocean gushed from the shattered eyepiece. A cascade of freezing water hammered the control room deck, but Steiner, who had been waiting for this moment, stepped into the waterfall. He held his hands under it. He opened his mouth. He let the water hit his face, and he spat. He spat on the steel deck. "Mr. Vogel," he said, and the crew had never heard this sound in his voice before. It was not madness. It was not rage. It was joy. A terrible, black, predatory joy. He wiped his mouth. "Mr. Vogel," he grinned, "this water, it is filth. It is impure." He put his hands back under the gushing water, rubbing it between his fingers. "It is diesel. It is bilge oil. It is the waste of a fleet." He had tasted them. He had smelled them on the water pouring from his own broken eye. "They are here," he growls, "and they are asleep." He looked at his first officer, his eyes burning with a fire that eclipsed the madness. "Prepare all torpedo tubes. Forward and aft. We have work to do." The hunt was over. The slaughter was about to begin. The slaughter was not immediate. It was art. It was a slow, meticulous, and utterly insane piece of performance art, with Rolf Steiner as its sole demonic conductor. The crew of U-505, now bound to their captain by a shared traumatic psychosis, moved like surgeons in a dark, flooded room. They were no longer a military crew. They were a cult, and the ritual was about to begin. "All stop," Steiner commanded. His voice for the first time was not a roar or a whisper. It was a cold, clinical instrument. "Torpedo room, flood all tubes, forward and aft, set all eels for 4 meters. Impact pistols, electric. We will be silent." The gurgle of the torpedo tubes being flooded was the only sound, a liquid promise of the violence to come. They were at a dead stop, 20 meters below the surface, in the heart of a harbor they could not see, surrounded by a fleet they could only smell. "Now, Mr. Vogel," Steiner said, a terrible calm settling on him. "We will draw. A map. Helmsman, all ahead. 1 knot. Bearing. Due north." The U-boat began to crawl, a ghost in the black, oily water. "Every 500 meters, Steiner commanded, we stop, and we taste." For the next 2 hours, this was the new, terrifying rhythm. The boat would crawl. It would stop. "Raise the attack scope," Steiner would order. The whining hydraulics would lift the broken tube. The cascade of freezing, filthy water would gush from the eyepiece. And Steiner would be there, his hands, face, and open mouth in the torrent. He was a sommelier of the enemy's filth. He was analyzing. He would hold the water on his tongue, his eyes closed. He would rub the oily film between his fingers. "Diesel. Fresh," he would mutter. And "coal smoke." And "galley waste. This is a cruiser. A big one. Boilers. Warm." He would turn to Vogel. "Market. Bearing. 310. Range. Indeterminate, but close. The taste is hot." Vogel, his face a gray mask, would make a grease pencil mark on the chart, A, with the word hot next to it. "Downscope," Steiner would order. "Helmsman. Bearing. 045. Crawl." And the process would repeat. They moved in a slow, agonizing grid pattern across the black, still water of the fjord. Stop. Raise. Gush. Taste. "This one. Colder," Steiner would mutter, spitting on the deck. "This is bunker fuel, heavy, and rope, hemp, not a warship. A freighter, a big transport, anchored, cold." Vogel would make another mark. "Cold, hemp. Stop. Raise, gush, taste. This is different," Steiner whispered, a note of excitement in his voice. "This is high-octane aviation fuel. The smell, it's pure. A tanker, a fleet oiler. Oh, she is beautiful. Hot fuel." The chart, once a blank expanse of the fjord, was becoming a new kind of document. It was a map of sensation, a cartography of taste and smell. It was Rolf Steiner's menu. The crew watched this. Their minds stretched to the breaking point. Their captain was navigating them through a minefield of sleeping steel giants, choosing his targets by flavor. He was a vampire, tasting the blood of the fleet before the kill. The young torpedo officer, a man named Kriegbaum, was near the edge. He was supposed to calculate firing solutions. A firing solution requires range. It requires speed. It requires angle on the bow. He had nothing. He had a madman telling him to aim at the warm one. "Capitan," Kriegbaum stammered, his voice cracking. I cannot. I need a range. I can only guess. We will miss." Steiner turned, the water from the last tasting dripping from his chin. He walked over to the terrified young officer. He put a heavy, wet hand on his shoulder. "Officer," Steiner said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "you are thinking like a technician. I need you to think like a butcher. They are anchored. They are not moving. Speed is 0. Angle on the bow is irrelevant. We are not shooting at a moving target. We are executing a sleeping one." He pointed at the chart. "We are here." He pointed at the marks. "They are there. We are inside the herd. We cannot miss. The range is point blank." He grinned, his teeth black in the dim red light. We are not sniping them. We are gutting them. Kriegbaum's terror was replaced by a cold, sharp realization. The captain was right. They were surrounded. It was like being in a dark room full of balloons with a fistful of needles. You didn't have to aim. You just had to swing. The madness, it had a logic, a terrible, brutal logic. After 3 hours, Steiner was done. He stood over the chart. It was covered in his grease pencil madness. Hot, fuel. Big, cold, hemp. Warm, coal. This, he announced to the room, is our battleground. He tapped the chart. We are here. He drew a circle around the U-boat's position. He was by his own taste map, perfectly triangulated between the 3 largest signatures, the warm coal cruiser, the hot fuel tanker, and the big cold hemp transport. He was in a killer's sweet spot. Mr. Vogel, Steiner said, his voice now a low, predatory growl. Our patrol is over. We are empty. We are going home. But we will not take our toys with us. He turned to Kriegbaum. Officer, Tube 1 and 2, bearing 030, the warm, coal. The cruiser. Jawohl, Herr Kapitän. Tube 3 and 4, bearing 350, the big cold, the transport. Jawohl. Now, Steiner said, his voice dropping. The aft tubes, all 4. Tubes 7, 8, 9, and 10, bearing 185, the hot, fuel. The tanker, we will. Warm her up. All tubes, set, Kriegbaum yelled, his voice now high and tight with a wild, infectious hysteria. The control room was a bomb. The air was thick, unbreathable. The crew was vibrating. We fire. All at once, Steiner whispered. We give them no time. We give them Armageddon. We will hit them from 3 sides, from the inside. He was a spider at the center of his new invisible web. Torpedo room, forward, stand by. Aft, stand by. The men in the torpedo rooms were clinging to their levers, their faces slick with sweat and oil. Forward tubes, 1 through 4. Fewer! Steiner roared. 4 terrible, pressurized whooshes. 4 electric eels, slicing the black water. Aft tubes, 7 through 10. Fewer. 4 more whooshes from the stern. 8 torpedoes, all running silent, all running on a madman's guess, all streaking towards sleeping, cold steel. 8 torpedoes, not 10. Steiner held up his hand. Hold. Tube 5 and 6. He whispered, a mad gleam in his eye. For dessert. The seconds stretched. The crew was paralyzed. They had just thrown 8 spears into the dark. They waited. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. 30 seconds. The only sound was the drip. Drip of the leaking pipe. Vogel was shaking. He had been right. It was madness. He had missed. Steiner was a statue, his head tilted, listening. 45 seconds. And then it came. It was not a boom. It was a shudder, a deep, low whump as the first torpedo hit the transport. And then, an instant later, whump, whump, 2 more, the transport. And then, from the other side, boom, a sharper, more violent explosion, the cruiser. And then, another. The U-boat was kicked, slammed, thrown sideways by the concussions. Men were screaming. Gauges were shattering. But it wasn't. Over. From the aft. A 5th explosion. A 6th. The hot fuel. The tanker. And this. This was not a boom. This was the sun. A new sound came. A deep, colossal, roaring whoosh as the fleet oiler, loaded with 20 tons of high-octane aviation fuel, detonated. It was not an explosion. It was an event. The entire fjord was lit up, from the inside out. The shockwave was so powerful that it lifted the 700-ton U-boat, which was still 20 meters below the surface, a full 10 feet, and then slammed it down. The hull shrieked, a sound of pure metallic agony. Alarms. Outside the boat were blaring, claxons, sirens, shouts, the sound of chaos. And then, the secondary, the cruiser's magazine, cooked off. A massive, sympathetic detonation that was so bright. The red emergency lights of the control room were momentarily washed out by a white-hot flash that came through the gushing water of the periscope. The fjord, the safe harbor, had been transformed in 90 seconds into a lake of burning fire, and in the center of this man-made volcano, Rolf Steiner stood, drenched, his hands on his periscope handles, and he began to laugh. It was not a human sound. It was a high, shrieking, victorious cackle. He had done it. He had gutted them, blind. The U-505 was a toy in a bathtub being kicked by a giant. She was thrown, slammed, and rattled by a typhoon of her own making. The concussions from the tanker and the cruiser's magazine were so immense that they were no longer sharp booms. They were a continuous, roaring physical pressure that threatened to crush the hull. A new leak sprang in the forward torpedo room. The men who had been shrieking in victory were now screaming in terror, as the very water they had set on fire was trying to kill them. But Rolf Steiner was not screaming. He was listening. Above the din of the explosions, the shrieking alarms, the groaning of his own hull, he heard a new, beautiful sound. Propellers, fast ones, turbines, the sound of panic, the sound of a sleeping, wounded herd, now awake, stampeding in the dark. "They are! Running!" he roared over the chaos, a wild, wolfish grin splitting his face. "They are! Blind! They are! Fools!" The surviving destroyers, their captains in shock, were scrambling to get underway, their engines churning the water into a froth, their sonar pinging uselessly into a sea of fire, explosions, and the screams of their own dying men. "Now! Mr. Vogel!" Steiner bellowed, his eyes alight. "Now! For our dessert! Helmsman! Take us! Up! Periscope depth!" Vogel was paralyzed. "Sir! Up! Into... that? They are awake! They will see us! They will ram us!" "They see nothing," Steiner cackled. "They see fire. They see ghosts. They are shooting at shadows. And we will give them a real one. Take her up." The boat, its ballast tanks blowing, rocketed toward the surface. It was the most insane, counterintuitive, suicidal move of the entire night. To ascend into the heart of the inferno, into the middle of the panicking, hunting destroyers. The U-boat burst through the surface, its conning tower breaking the water, which was no longer water. It was a sheet of burning fuel. The boat was, for a moment, on fire. "Raise the scope!" Steiner yelled. The technician, his hands burned, his eyes wide with a disciple's fanaticism, hit the hydraulics. The tube whined, and the cascade of water from the eyepiece stopped. It was replaced by a new, hellish light. The interior of the control room was no longer red. It was a flickering, brilliant, retina-searing orange. The burning fjord was so bright that it was shining down the 20-foot tube of the broken periscope. The shattered, flooded lens assembly was now a torch, a column of firelight that illuminated the control room like the mouth of a furnace. Steiner stepped in front of it. He was bathed in the flickering light of his own creation. He was a demon, returned from hell. "Mr. Vogel," he whispered, his voice full of a terrible, profound awe. "They have given us light." He put his eye not to the broken, gushing hole, but near it. He was not looking through it. He was looking at it. He was using the open tube as a pinhole, a simple, primitive lens. And in the flickering orange light, he could see shadows, the silhouettes, the panicked, scrambling shapes of the surviving fleet, black cutouts against the wall of fire. "Beautiful," he breathed. "Oh, it is. Beautiful." He saw it, a massive, heavy shape, the other cruiser, the flagship. She was underway, turbines screaming, trying to escape the harbor. "There. You are," Steiner purred. "Tubes. 5 and 6. Bearing. 090. She is. Running. Set. Speed 30 knots. Depth. 3 meters. Kriegbaum, his face a mask of ecstatic terror, his mind, long past the point of questioning, made the calculations. "Solution. Set. Fuhr," Steiner roared. The U-boat, still on the surface, still on fire, bucked as its last two forward torpedoes leaped from their tubes. This time there was no wait. They were on the surface. They saw the tracks, and so did the cruiser. Klaxons blared. Guns, 20mm cannons, opened up on the conning tower of the U-505. Tracers ripped the night, pinging and clanging against the steel, inches from Steiner's head. "Dive!" Steiner bellowed, his laugh mingling with the sound of the gunfire. "Take her to the mud! Dive! Dive! Dive!" As the U-boat's conning tower, still smoking, vanished beneath the waves, the two torpedoes found their mark. They struck the cruiser Glasgow broadside, one in the engine room, one in the forward magazine. The ship that had been fleeing at 30 knots simply disintegrated. The explosion was a final, deafening, obscene punctuation mark on Steiner's sermon of madness. The dessert had been served. And then they were back in the dark. The U-505 was plunging, out of control, its hull screaming, its crew being tossed like dolls as the shockwave of their final kill hammered them back into the deep. The next 24 hours were not war. They were a purging. The boat was a wreck. They had settled once again into the thick, stinking mud at the bottom of the fjord. And above them, the ocean. Boiled. The surviving destroyers, 3 of them, were in a state of primal, hysterical rage. They knew he was here. They knew he was at the bottom, and they were not letting him go. They began a systematic, hour-by-hour saturation. Boom. Crump. Boom. The depth charges rained down, not in a pattern, but in a storm. They were not hunting. They were exterminating. Inside U-505, the world was ending. The lights were gone, for good. The red emergency lights. Shattered. They were in total, absolute, crushing blackness. The air was gone. The CO2 scrubbers were long dead. The men were panting, their lungs on fire, their vision red. Hypoxia was setting in. The leaks opened by Steiner's own explosions were gushing. The bilge pumps were overwhelmed. The water in the control room was knee-deep. And it was hot. The depth charges were boiling the fjord. Vogel, the man of paper, had broken. He was sitting in the corner, in the oily hot water, weeping, singing a children's song. The crew was dying. They were suffocating in their own tomb. But Steiner was alive. He was at his post, his hands on his broken silent periscope tube. He was again, just listening. He was timing the explosions. He was feeling the patterns. He was waiting. For 8 hours the storm raged. And then it lessened. The explosions were more sporadic. "They are tired," Steiner rasped, his own voice thick from the lack of oxygen. "They are empty. They are leaving." The destroyers, their racks empty, their sonar screens a mess of echoes from the wrecks and the explosions, were convinced nothing could have survived. They were finally leaving the fjord to rescue the survivors. Steiner waited. He waited for 6 more hours. In the blackness, in the silence, in the hot rising water, the men were unconscious. They were dying of suffocation. "Now," Steiner whispered to the helmsman who was barely alive, "now, we crawl." He was once again using his hands on the periscope. He was feeling his way out, blind, deaf, suffocating. He was navigating the granite maze out by touch. The crawl was an eternity. Every man was his own priest, his own god. The only sound was the slosh of the water in the boat, the gasp of dying men, and the scrape of the hull against the mud. They reached the net. They went under. They reached the open sea. And then, and only then, surface, Steiner croaked. The ballast tanks, on their last burst of air, blew. The U-505, a 700-ton corpse, breached the surface of the open Atlantic. The conning tower hatch was blown open. And the air, the clean, cold, glorious air, flooded the boat. Men who were seconds from death coughed. They awoke. They lived. When U-505 arrived in Lorient 3 weeks later, it was a ghost. It was a rust-red, perforated, oil-stained wreck. It had no periscopes. It had no deck gun. Half of its conning tower was melted. It was a ship that had, by all laws, been sunk, and from it emerged Rolf der Verrückte Steiner. He was gaunt. His hair was white. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had seen the bottom of hell and found it lacking. His report was filed. An entire fleet sunk. Blind. High Command read it, and they buried it. It was simply too insane. It was the lie of a madman, a captain trying to cover for the loss of his boat. He was declared unfit. He was retired. His crew was scattered, their stories dismissed as combat shock. It was not until after the war when the British Admiralty released its own classified, secret, ashamed reports. The report of Task Force Ocelot, of 2 cruisers, 1 tanker, and 3 transports, lost in a single night, in a safe harbor, by a phantom attacker, that the truth of Steiner's report was known. The mad captain had not lied. He had, in his madness, seen the truth. He had tasted the water, and he had eaten a fleet.